Take cars. I'm absolutely delighted that David Cameron has begun to kick government ministers out of their absurd ministerial cars. Though, frankly, I would go further. I would take away any kind of taxpayer subsidy for any member of the political classes to drive a car in London, because we want these people down the tube with the rest of us. We want them strap-hanging and armpit-nuzzling all August until they understand the vital importance of building Crossrail, installing air conditioning, and generally investing in London's transport infrastructure. Yeah. And insofar, thank you, insofar as the papers are now publishing long-lens, naughty shots of ministers getting into their ministerial cars when they should be riding a bike, that is a good thing. But it is, nonetheless, a measure of the changed and fallen state of politicians. If they are so lucky as to be lunched by Bill Haggerty or a powerful editor, they must now expect to come out of the restaurant in search of the bus, while the editor is still waiting to be picked up by his gliding air-conditioned Merc, or take expenses, the cause of all the recent woe. Following the trail blazed by City Hall, politicians across the land are now obliged to register everything and to put it online, where all claims are deservedly open to the scorn and ridicule of the public. But what about the press, who orchestrate the scorn and the ridicule? What about their expenses, If you were a self-pitying sort of politician, you might think that these matters were protected by a sort of omerta, a freemasonry of silence. I seem to think that there is a famous BBC presenter, NB, who bought a farmhouse in Wales on the proceeds of his lavish expenses in South Africa. And I fondly remember a BBC colleague in Brussels who claimed for a lawnmower without taking the essential precaution of owning a lawn. And take the contrast with our general methods of work. This is actually true. Our general methods of work, where politicians are now required to be so slavishly transparent that it has now become virtually impossible to compose a confidential memorandum. Any letter or email that I write can now be instantly demanded by the media under the terms of the Freedom of Information Act, with what I think is a bad result, that politicians are increasingly deciding not to write things down, or at least not in a form that can be electronically transmitted. If there is one thing that is reviving the ancient art of sitting down, writing a letter, putting a stamp on it, and popping it in the post, it is the blasted Freedom of Information Act. Journalists, on the other hand, are under no such obligations. They can carry on with their traditional practices of bugging, stinging, trapping, and generally monstering their targets with absolutely no system of redress or accountability. They pay public workers to breach the privacy of the public. How else do you think we get to hear about what happens in hospitals or in police stations, for instance? And yet no one dares to lift a finger against them. They are regulated by a press complaints commission whose luminaries include the editor of the Daily Mail. I'm sure that he is a fine fellow in many ways, but it is a bit like putting the regulation of door-to-door salesmen in the hands of the Boston Strangler. I've ended my political career many times, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm sure that the distinguished editor of the Daily Mail will take that remark in the spirit that it was made. The media, moreover, is now abetted. The media is now abetted by a hydra-headed army of public apprentices, armed with camera phones and the ability to upload anything embarrassing instantly onto the internet. Now, has anyone got a glass of water? Yeah, thank you. Take all these things together. What have we had so far? The cars, the salaries, the expenses, the general pattern of behavior, and I think that you might conceivably start to be feeling a smidgen of sympathy for the poor, battered politicians. You might start to think that there was something unhealthy in this change in the balance of power. You might start to feel that the power of the media has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished. Is it possible that that is what you feel? Do you feel a scintilla of that? If you do, I urge you very, very strongly to fight it. Dismiss it out of hand. It's nonsense. So the media don't declare their salaries or their expenses. Well, with the exception of the BBC, they are employed by private companies and they can do what they want in that respect. And yes, the media occasionally trap people in a way that seems monstrously unfair. I couldn't for the life of me see the public interest in what they did to Lord Treesman. But then along comes the hilarious tape of the Duchess of York and the fake sheikh, where publication was patently justified. Do you not think? I think it did. Not least because it provided a heartwarming proof of the vibrancy of the London economy. Here we have a single mother of modest means setting up a business in the back room of a London restaurant where she proposes to charge foreigners £500,000 for the privilege of talking to Prince Andrew. That is enterprise. And we should be grateful. We should be grateful to the news of the world for reminding us that it is not dead. That story took time, it took resources, it took money, not least the $40,000 the Duchess removed from the table, the whereabouts is still not, of which is still not clear. And my worry is frankly not so much about the behavior of the press. My worry, rather as Jeremy hinted, my worry is that technology is destroying the case for investing in excellent journalism of that kind. How can a newspaper website, subsidized by newspaper buyers, by buyers of hard copy newspapers, compete in the long term with a BBC website that is subsidized by a £145 tax on every TV-owning household in the country? It is monstrously unfair. And that is why I have some sympathy with Rupert Murdoch and his attempts to put the contents of the Times behind a paywall. Now, you can wonder whether it will work, and you can wonder how many people will pay to go behind the wall. But at least he is trying to protect and to justify the investment in quality journalism. And the real story of the last 18 months is how that journalism has proved its value to society. The expensive scoop of the Daily Telegraph was a magnificent vindication of old-fashioned investigative reporting. And it needed a broadsheet paper to give the story the projection and the explication it deserved. And yet it was also much, much more than that. After more than 10 years of economic splurge, it focused the minds of the public on the way politicians were spending their money. If you really want an answer to who has the whip hand in modern Britain, politicians or journalists, it was all there in that symbolic story of parliamentary excess. It's the politicians who take the decisions, I'm afraid. They wield the budgets. It's the politicians who have racked up a deficit of £156 billion and recklessly expanded the public sector vote bank. It is the politicians who decide to go to war on a lie. The best hope for our society is to have a strong and incorrigible media to contain their excesses of a kind that, of which Charles Wheeler was a shining example, to monitor their expenditure and generally to give them a tough time. And there, I'm afraid, I must leave it, because I think, as I think Jeremy Paxman would by now long ago have pointed out, I have a city to run. Thank you very much for listening, and I give you the undying memory of Charles Wheeler.